actually our guest speaker today. My name is Jorge Duane, I'm the director of the Cuban Research Institute that organizes today's talk. And we're very happy to have Dr. Maria Alejandra Perez, who is an assistant professor in the geography program at West Virginia University, Department of Geology and Geography. She previously held what her resume lists as a postdoc, which I'm assuming is a postdoc fellowship in the same department. She earned her PhD and MA in sociocultural anthropology at the University of Michigan, and also holds a BA in economics and Russian and Eastern European studies, which is kind of interesting, but maybe you can talk to us about that later. Her work documents and analyzes the historical and present role of field science activity, especially, and I want to pronounce this correctly, speleology, which is cave science and exploration for those of you who are not experts in the topic. And then how that relates to the shaping of regional and national identities with a focus on the Americas. She began her research with speleologists in Venezuela, her country of origin, then moved on to do fieldwork in Cuba, the United States, and is now developing, or is currently working on a project in Puerto Rico. Her research projects have been supported by the National Science Foundation, the National Speleological Society, and the Venezuelan Society for Speleology. She has published extensively in several professional journals. In fact, I think all the major geography journals: Political Geography, Geographical Review, Social and Cultural Geography, Human Geography, Cultural Geographies, Latin American Geography, and the Boletín de la Sociedad Venezolana de Speleología. In addition, she has co-authored or authored chapters for books such as the Encyclopedia of Caves, published in 2019, Caving Basics, 2016, and I was intrigued by this because he collaborated with a well-known textbook on anthropology, The Exploration of Human Diversity, edited by Conway Kabak in 2009. In addition, Dr. Perez has presented her work in numerous conferences, including our own conference, the Cuban Research Institute conference, I think twice, no? In the last decade or so. But also the American Anthropological Association, the Association of American Geographers, the National Speleological Society, the Royal Geographical Society, and the American Historical Association. So please help me welcome Dr. Maria Alejandra Perez.
So I've decided not to use the microphone. I'm going to use my lecturing voice. I think I'm going to be okay. But you let me know if I go down. All right. So today I'm going to be talking to you about Cuba's geographies of speleology. I'm going to be talking about exploration, mapping, and conservation of the caves and karst of Cuba. So on January 15th in 1960, Fidel Castro said, "The future of our nation ought to be necessarily a future of men of science." The statement is often brought up when noting Cuba's revolutionary scientific achievements, right? Yet its context is rarely acknowledged. Castro said this in a room full of speleologists, right? Women and men dedicated to the exploration and scientific study of caves and karst, who were celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Sociedad Speleológica de Cuba, okay? Castro, who became an honorary member of this organization on that day, also noted the following. So I put my quotes on the screen so that you can read along with me so that you know they are quotes, and then you can also see my sources. So the reason why you see that text is that I can acknowledge the source of my quotes, all right? So he said, "We need to find new speleologists. A cave is not only useful from the scientific point of view or from the point of view of tourism or the economic point of view. A cave also is useful from the military point of view. We Cubans need to have a full knowledge of every grotto, every cave. Us Cubans need to have knowledge of each mountain, each valley, each river, each feature of the territory, of every tree. We need to know our nature and identify with it." Now, I don't think there's a group of Cubans more knowledgeable of the national landscape than speleologists or cavers. I'm going to use the terms interchangeably, all right? So here's actually an image of a world-class example of karst. So karst is the kind of terrain that is formed by the dissolution of mildly acidic water, so it's usually limestone. So this is Viñales, okay, the famous valley of Viñales, and many of these mogotes, okay, are crisscrossed with really large caverns. So this is like classic karst landscape. And like 65% of the Cuban territory is karst. And estimates, like very modest estimates, put the number of caves in Cuba at around 3,000, right? So speleologists' interests and scientific contributions, often acquired without formal professional training, range from geology, geography, cartography, biology, and even archaeology. They are involved in rescue efforts, conservation projects, and environmental education. Speleologists are always willing diggers in archaeological projects, something that is not unique to Cuba. And also, their positive relations with rural communities are legendary. Now, Castor's quote suggests an additional role of speleologists as military strategists in national defense. In fact, during the Cold War, Cuba's Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias, or the FARC, requested that SEC, so I'm going to call, Sociedad Speleológica Cuba, I'm just going to say SEC, very long word, very small acronym, all right? So requested that SEC members identify and modify caves for military purposes, such as equipment storage and civilian bunkers. In the mid-60s, and particularly in the 1980s, the FARC's heightened strategic interest in caves involved cavers even more. So what I'm going to be talking about today is giving you a glimpse of how that relationship evolved, okay, between the speleologists and the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias. I'm going to be focusing on that. However, I'm going to do so by focusing on some of the material, social, and symbolic qualities of speleological practice. And I must explain that I'm a cultural anthropologist by training, okay? I'm into culture. I study the culture of science. And originally, I was going to get a PhD looking at the impact of the collapse of the Soviet Union on Russian state science. That was my original intent when I went to graduate school. But then in 2002, I joined a cavers expedition in Venezuela, and it changed my life. My father was on that expedition, actually, and it just blew my mind. There were these, this was an expedition of the Sociedad Venezolana de Speleología, and I must tell you right now that among us is an ex-member of that society, my dear Aunt Norca Perez, was a member of the society, and she would go out and explore caves and map them with a group that I must admit was mostly men, but not always and not exclusively, and she can speak to that. And I was just blown away by an activity that involved physical efforts, exploration, it involved science, and it also involved, I'll get to that in a moment, but there's also a human kind of like family story here, right? So actually this is my father when he was about 16 years of age, and here is my godfather, a man who was actually an insurance agent. He didn't even graduate from high school, but they were involved in this civic science that contributed knowledge to the nation, right? So that actually became my PhD project after that 2002 trip to Venezuela, okay? Now, yes, I did have to tell you that the family tradition continues. So this is my youngest daughter, and she loves to crawl under her bread, and she made me very, very proud, so very, very proud. Now, I also need to, so I emphasize this story. Now, I am not new in emphasizing the human story of cave exploration. In fact, I was expecting Chris Nicola to be here. He said he would be here. There's a dear friend of mine who's also a caver. He's from New York, and he traveled to Ukraine to explore his ancestry, and he learned about an extraordinary story of a group of Jewish families that survived the Holocaust by hiding in a cave. And actually, here's a plug for his documentary called No Place on Earth. And again, it was through the exploration of these familial, these kinship networks that we discovered an extraordinary story of survival, all right? So back to Cuba. Yes, I will talk about geopolitics. Yes, I will talk about the military. But I will do so in a way that reveals the deeply affective and relational approach to how humans relate to the hidden dimensions of the earth and to each other. And from this perspective, Cuban speleologists remind us of the multiple and contested values of the underground beyond, for example, its commodification or militarization. Okay? Now, a quick note on methods. So I have traveled multiple times to Cuba since 2013. I've attended many events. I've participated in not formal expeditions, but I've been caving with cavers in Cuba. I'm actually going there tomorrow to attend this Congress, the 80th anniversary of the SEC. And I will say, though, that the theme of the military was not original to my research project, but it just kept coming up in the interviews. So I thought, okay, you know, I have this paper under review where I've been putting together some of the insights, and these are the insights that I share with you today, okay? Now, this is how I'm organizing my talk. I'm going to briefly introduce Cuban speleology. I'm going to be talking about the military in Cuba from its speleological dimensions. I'm going to be focusing a little bit on the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and then I'm going to be talking about relatedness and alternate conceptions of value. And finally, I will end with some concluding remarks, all right? So onward with the first part, introducing Cuban speleology. So Aguirre Noy, Diaz, Sanchez Cerru, and Antonio Núñez Jiménez founded the Speleological Society of Cuba in Havana in 1940. Aware of the problematic tendency to reduce Cuban history to key biographies, a topic that some of you in your center have written very well about, I have to tell you something about Antonio Núñez Jiménez because he's key to the story, okay? So here's an image of Núñez Jiménez. So he was a revolutionary fighter next to Che Guevara. He was part of the ACE, he was part of Ciro Redondo. You know, he was involved in saving Castro and Guevara by hiding them in a cave, right? He was the first director of the Institute of Agrarian Reform. He was Cuba's ambassador to Peru, deputy in Cuba's National Assembly, among many other prominent positions. But the key here is that he was always dedicated to speleology and was the president of the SEC until his death in 1998. Now, Núñez Jiménez embodies, you know, the male barbudo archetype of the Cuban revolutionary, but with an important added quality. And that quality is that as a geographer and a speleologist, he had deep knowledge of the territory, literally, right? This knowledge was valuable not just to the rebel army that would constitute the core of the FARC, but also the struggle against the bandidos, or enemies of the revolution. Specifically, Núñez Jiménez's geographic studies of central Cuba were of strategic importance to Che Guevara's rebel forces operating in this region. In fact, Núñez Jiménez was eventually named Rebel Army Captain. So from the beginning, Núñez Jiménez promoted a speleology in the service of the nation. Cuban geographer Sara Isabel de Masip notes that Núñez Jiménez, quote, for him, geography and revolution have always been the harmonious two faces of the same medallion, okay? In his introduction to his book, Geografía y Speleología en Revolución, published by the FARC in 1987, Núñez Jiménez says, geography has in Cuba a beautiful tradition of popular service, on occasion passionately revolutionary and culminating in the socialist project, okay? Further, he says, during the last 50 years, the development of geography in our country has been indissolubly linked to the Speleological Society of Cuba. This institution has dedicated itself to the constant exploration and study of the surface, subsoil, submarine platform of the Cuban territory, okay? So really involved in promoting the social reality of our fatherland, okay? Now, there is a long tradition of linking Cuba's subterranean and other hidden dimensions with the defense, with the defense of the territory and its social reality. And yet, you know, it's amazing. You look at scholarship on the history of the Cuban military, almost nobody makes any reference to its geography, except for very brief accidentes del terreno and climate, and maybe mosquitoes. But there's really no serious engagement with this broader dimension of the geography of Cuba, so my work is actually a contribution towards that. I should put in a plug for an extraordinary chapter that just came out by my dear colleague and friend, Reynaldo Funes Monzote, who is a historian, a historical geographer. But anyway, so he also deals with geography in very intense ways, but in general, geography is kind of like dismissed, or at least not attended to the degree that it should, okay? All right. So, moving on to the second theme. Placing Cuba's military, exploring its speleological dimensions. So scholars have noted how Cuba in particular bucks the militarization trends present in Latin America more generally. So while Cuba is typically believed to be a militarized country, a comparative perspective on the role of the military in other Latin American contexts suggests that the militarized dictatorship descriptor does not fit Cuba. Some scholars contend that the FARC has not been a repressive body of its own people, which arguably distinguishes it from the Latin American norm. And to give you another example of this, so historian Jorge Dominguez has noted that Cubans are correct in saying that their armed forces differ from those in former communist Europe or Latin America. In the 70s and 80s, the level of competence and professionalism achieved by Cuba's victorious armed forces, really ranked them among the world's most competent. Okay. Now, I will say that this debate about the exceptionality of Cuba is very heated, it's very complex, and it's an important one. I will say that this exceptionality has also been noted by cavers around the world. So this is actually a quote from a prominent Italian geologist, Forti, who said that in the case of Cuba, there's this kind of power, even political, absolutely unique in the world. Suffice it to say, remember that within the Cuban army, there was a speleological brigade, okay? So this was very tantalizing for me to explore, to get a better sense of this relationship. So let me tell you a little bit about the 1960s. And the key theme here are these sectorial surveys and the consolidation of caver data. So let's see. So the most well-known link between caves and Cuba's revolutionary military activity in the 60s is Cueva de los Portales, okay? Located in Pinar del Rio. So during the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, this is where Che Guevara was hiding, right? And in 1987, it was made a tourist site. But this was this was not the only place that was transformed in Cuba to prepare it militarily for the possible and eventual, in fact, in the case of the 1960s, invasion from the United States. Okay, already the systematic incorporation of Cuba's underground in national military preparedness was underway. So I'm going to be giving you a series of quotes from one of my key informants. So this is Leslie Molerio Leon, a prominent geologist and caver in Cuba, still alive, working in Cuba. And he has been a very willing and a very candid informant about his relationship with the military. So many of his quotes are going to come from him. And he agreed to have his true identity revealed. Other people I just keep anonymous, but for some people who insisted, they are noted here by name. All right? So he told me that already since the early 1960s, when the precursory Milicias Nacionales Revolucionarias were created, a subordinate group was founded. The Ministerio de... So I'm going to forget. So it's the National Revolutionary Militias Departamento de Exploraciones Subterráneas. And I'm going to be a mess with the Spanish and the English. I told myself this would be in English, so bear with me. Let me try to do my best to stick with English. All right, so this is what he's telling me. And he also said, in 1966, many speleologists, including myself, participated in the sectorial surveys of the theater of military operations. And I'm just going to refer to them as TOM, okay, or ETOM, in different provinces in the country. Moreover, the work that Ercilio Bento Canosa, true identity used with his permission, did as a head of this group in Matanzas is laudable even today and resulted in the survey and census of hundreds of caves in Matanzas. And we did this during the time when we were high school students and exploring during the weekend, right? All right, let me tell you a little bit more about the 1960s, but let me take you to Santiago de Cuba. This time, these quotes are anonymous. I'm just going to call my source, Mr. Ruiz. That's not the real name, but these are anonymous. And this person whom I interviewed and had memory of these times in the 60s told me, you know, I asked him about his role exploring caves, and he said that Núñez Jiménez told him to be involved in making a list of caves in the country. And I asked him, like, if he would tell people like why he was doing that. And he said, no, I wouldn't say anything. I didn't know if they were gusanos or revolutionaries, although they probably knew that I was with the revolution because I wore olive green military fatigues and I traveled in a military jeep. And then he pulled out a book. He told his wife, please bring me this book. So he brings out this book that he tells me, he does not let me see, but he tells me had all the listings of the caves that he gathered in the 1960s. And he told me that this effort resulted in this very secret book for the Army that was published and given to the admirals. All right? So I'm going quickly because I have a few minutes and I'm going to get to the 1980s and then to some of my evaluations of this history. 1970s. The key story here is the restructuring of the Sociedad Speleológica de Cuba. This is when, in the 1970s, when the organization became truly national. So there were caver clubs all over the country, okay? There was no sense that they were all united. But part of Núñez Jiménez's efforts in collaboration and working with, for example, the FARC, was to try to have some kind of coordination nationally, right? But in fact, the person who really led this effort was Ercilio Bento Canosa, whom I've already mentioned. He was a doctor and caver from Matanzas, and he actually took the presidency of the SEC when Núñez Jiménez was ambassador to Peru, okay? So it was during this time that the comités espeleológicos were created, provinciales. So every province kind of organized all of the clubs, and then they would have representatives, and then from there, they would have representation in the leadership of the national organization. But one of the wild things of this kind of structure is that it actually did not result in a centralized repository of caves. So we lack a centralized repository of cave locations and maps, which meant, because they were held by the provinces, and this meant that the FARC needed to seek out cave maps from each province. Okay? I found this very, very interesting. I'm going to come back to this issue shortly because it's highly consequential to the relationship between the military and the cavers. Okay? Now, I asked other cavers from Matanzas how this relationship with the FARC worked out. And what they would tell me is that in their case, we had a great relationship, right? The military created a funcionario de espeleología position, a post filled by a civilian, not an army officer. And actually, it was the cavers who decided who filled that post, all right? More here. Other people telling me, oh, so this idea of having the maps divided or organized by provinces, according to this caver, amounted to a divide and you will conquer approach. And this is, I'm gonna paraphrase him, this is how he explained it to me. Oh, you want the maps? Sure, you can get them, but the provinces are the ones who have them. And then you have to go to the provinces to get them. And what this caver mentioned, and this has been something echoed by other speleologists throughout the country, is that this created an opportunity for engagement at the local and regional level. And cavers were able to better negotiate their needs with the military. What were those needs? The cavers needed helmets, lights, transportation, okay? The military was happy to provide these materials if the cavers provided the information that the military needed. But if you were able to negotiate those relationships at the regional and local level, you had a greater chance of getting what you wanted, you know, instead of having a Havana decide everything. And in fact, this kind of regional arrangement is something that is not unique to speleology. Certainly throughout the history of Cuba, there have been efforts to kind of counter the centralization of all kinds of government activity or economic activity with Havana, right? So this is not, but this, in this case, again, this led to kind of like this regional level of relationships, okay? All right, so 1980s, All right, so moving on quickly. So many Cuban cavers recall the 1980s as a time of frenzied speleological activity. The reason was the increased role that the underground, caves, built tunnels as well, etc., played in Cuba's military and civilian defense readiness. In fact, it was in this decade that Núñez Jiménez published his book, Geografía y Speleología en Revolución, a gift made to me back in 2013, and I think it was really, really interesting. And you know what? This was the decade that the Cuban state also grew increasingly wary of external threats, right? While at the same time receiving less support from the Soviet Union, which was facing its own challenges, right? It was like collapsing. Also, in 1983, Cuba intensified its military, so the US invaded Grenada in 1983, all right? And again, that was a time where there was this concern that there was going to be some aggression coming from the United States in Cuba again. So there was this strategy that was created called the Guerra de Todo el Pueblo, or War of All the People. So this was a campaign that was launched, okay? And this is an ideological and logistical strategy of hyperactive defense, okay? That depended not only on the participation of all Cubans, but also on the promotion of creativity and initiatives of the officer corps. I include my quote here. And part of what this involved was create this war would count also on the participation along with FARC soldiers of members of the Ejército Juvenil de Trabajo, the Milicia de Tropas Territoriales. And again, the idea was to create a deterrence system in which regulars would be a powerful professional force backed by a large conscript force serving 3-year terms of duty, all right? And indeed, it was during this time, so this MTT increased rapidly from about 500,000 people to 1.2 million people by 1984. Speleologists were part of this effort. In fact, Núñez Jiménez was designated president of the Special Speleological Formations, the Formaciones Especiales Speleológicas, the ones that Forti addressed back earlier when I started the talk, all right? Now, back to the objective. The objective of this work, and this is actually from Núñez Jiménez's book, was to divulge the best scientific and revolutionary traditions of the cavers and realize its patriotic and cultural values, especially at this time in which its members have the honor of constituting the Special Speleological Formation of the Territorial Troops Militias, okay? And in this way, they are also serving the fatherland. Now back to Molerio León, whom I quoted earlier, one of my key informants. Molerio León explained that he led numerous projects involving massive process of cave adaptations and tunnel constructions that took place in the 1980s, right? These efforts included continuing and updating the TOM surveys, right? Molerio León participated in no less than 2 major mobilizations of this kind that resulted in an impressive collection of data and information of these places. Much of the training effort that the TOM mobilization entailed established the foundations of what would become the speleology classes taught at the Escuela Nacional de Speleología, all right? I will tell you something about this escuela, this national school. Raúl Castro founded the school in December of 1984. The school is located next to one of Cuba's longest caves, the Gran Caverna Santo Tomás. And so here are the mogotes. This is in Pinar del Rio. Here are the mogotes, the Caverna de Santo Tomás. In fact, I think this is actually one of the many entrances to that system. So here's the school, right, for training. Here's the cave, right? And I have to show you a couple of really iconic images that have been taken in this cave. So there's an image of Fidel Castro in Santo Tomas. And here's another iconic image. I have to thank the archives of the Fundación Antonio Núñez Jiménez del Hombre y la Naturaleza. These are all images. So here's Antonio Núñez Jiménez, Fidel Castro, obviously, and Raúl Castro here. Images taken within Santo Tomas. So a place of a lot of historic significance, but again, also the place where military officers would learn about karst hydrology, right? And then in the afternoons, they would have practicums in the cave right there next to the school. Right? Very interesting. All right, so more from Leslie Morerio León, right? He said that during this time in the 80s, he was involved in the development or revision of standards and norms for the adaptation of caves and subterranean spaces, the construction of tunnels and subterranean storage areas for different uses, refrigeration, storage of consumption items, and other varied products, including clothes, all right? Also weapons, combat weapons, fuel, okay? He was also involved in the design or design improvements of systems of fortification of subterranean spaces. And also he was involved in the design of water capture systems and mountain aqueducts, okay? So anyway, this is really important because the issue of water and access to water was a really important part of not just people's livelihoods, but also in terms of defense. I mean, if you don't have access to fresh water, that can also be viewed as a way of weakening your capacity to defend la nación, right? So I just wanted to say, again, just to give you an idea of how varied this relationship between the military and the cavers were, it really involved all of these elements as well, right? So I asked Morerio León, but weren't the cavers worried about the negative impact of cave modification during this time? And this is what he told me. So he said, my assessment of the caver-FAD cooperation is more than positive. It was not better, perhaps, because we were not capable on one side or the other to better identify priorities and ways of achieving them. And he continues, in total honesty, I believe that this was an absolutely necessary and almost essential chapter in the history of Cuba that is of much greater transcendence than the situation that in some cases, some features of the landscape were damaged or destroyed. And he said, granted that, as I personally noted in several instances, there were absurd actions, unworkable adaptations, or useless works. Okay, so there were caves that were destroyed unnecessarily, and this is something that was kind of a big debate within the caver community. There is no doubt that many cavers really felt dedicated to using the landscape to defend the nation, but many people, increasingly the younger people, growing up at a time of greater environmental awareness, were questioning whether or not this was the proper use of caves and karst for the defense of the nation. Okay? Now, I'm going to give you an extraordinary example of that power that the cavers had to kind of negotiate the use of the landscape for military purposes. So my dear colleague and friend, Reinaldo Funes Monzote, found for me a document from the Ministerio de las Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias, okay, written to Antonio Núñez Jiménez and explaining how the FAD, the military, was going to abide by certain recommendations to conserve the caves and karst of Cuba, all right? So the letter, just give you some notes. So it says, during the studies done during our TOM, these surveys, a great number of caves have been identified with potential military use. This work will be expanded considerably with the work done by the SEC and the regional groups, right? With the objective of taking maximum advantage of the protective qualities of these caves, right? But also, look, this is really astonishing. Preserving their natural resources and cultural values, right? This is really extraordinary that this is noted in this document. And other things that are in this document. It says, we will avoid posting signage or painting cave walls or ceilings. We're not going to break cave formations. We will respect flora and fauna in the interior and exterior of caves. We are not going to dump liquids. We're not going to poop in the cave. We're not going to pee, we're going to be doing all these things. We're going to be really careful. And we're going to be prohibiting the construction inside or right at the entrance of a cave, all right? And then something else is really spectacular in this document. It says that the construction plans will be drafted with the regional Sociedad Speleológica de Cuba representatives, who will always civilians. Okay, just to give you an example of how much power, or at least written power, the Cuban Speleological Society had to try to be involved in an informed decision of the caves and karst resources of the country, even during this frenzied time of military preparedness, all right? Now, not everybody is this optimistic. I have interviewed cavers who are a bit more cynical. I interviewed a gentleman from, I'm actually not gonna say where he's from. I'm gonna keep him anonymous. And he said, look, there were these little benches. There was no water in these caves, no food. Many things were not taken into account in terms of the planning, right? They, and by they he means the military leadership, must have known that this whole thing of using caves as shelter, right, in case of a bombing campaign, was going to fail, right? And to him, these kinds of preparedness tactics were really going to result or amount in what he called these collective burial sites. This is really not going to work, okay? This is the opinion of this. But other people argue that, well, maybe not perfect, but it was worth doing something. It was a way for Cuba to use its natural resources to increase the likelihood of military preparedness in case of an invasion. And look, this is not unique to Cuba. It happened in the United States. Also in the 1960s, cavers were involved with Kennedy's administration of identifying caves in case of a nuclear attack, for example. And of course, we know of the military strategic value that caves and other underground spaces had in the Vietnam War, and still today, with people smuggling under, the national boundaries, frontiers between one country and another. It happens here between Mexico and the United States. It happens, for example, in Israel. So this is not a new thing, and there is proven evidence that being able to hide underground can be of great military strategic importance, right? So, yeah. Now, others would say, look, Núñez Jiménez was very intelligent. Although he was criticized for his decision to collaborate with the army, by agreeing to collaborate, he could participate, he could manage the situation, right? Another person said one of Núñez Jiménez's greatest triumphs was that he was able to defend caves, not just because of their military value, but also because of their natural, and I should add, cultural value, all right? So there is another caver who said, look, let me just tell you, you keep thinking that the military is separate from the people. And then this other caver said, but the FARC is the people, right? Which is a statement that was very important. But of course, the reverse is also true. Even if the power dynamics are not equal between the military leadership and the Cuban, civilian participation, the broad base of military participation opens up opportunities for engagement that would not have been there otherwise. Moreover, a closer look at who precisely constitutes the people, including their sense of identity and commitments, not just to one another, but to the landscape, reveals a complexity of relationships and arrangements that impact how we come to understand and conserve the underground. So with this I turn to this last theme. So, relatedness and alternative conceptions of value in Cuban speleology. All right. So, building on, but also critiquing the narrow assumptions underwriting past kinship studies, anthropologists use the term relatedness to account for the many ways in which humans relate to one another. So I'm going to give you some examples of relatedness in the story of Cuban speleology and how it impacted its relationship with the military. Now, Cuban speleologists express kinship in two ways in interviews. First, they describe it in terms of how they feel, with one another in a collective. They say speleologists are my brothers and sisters. They're my best friends. They're my family. Some have told me, even if we don't agree with each other, you know, outside of a cave, when we're inside of a cave, we help each other out, right? Elsewhere in my research, I've highlighted friendship's role in forging bonds between Cubans and Venezuelans, okay? Broadening our understanding of what we would call a geographies of speleology, right? And I will tell you that these bonds are strongest at the local and regional level, all right? Now, let me go back here and give you a sense of how this played out. When Núñez Jiménez in the 1960s was trying to kind of like constitute speleology for the service of the revolutionary state, he sought out people all over the country to help him in this process. And many of these people talk about Núñez Jiménez in kinship terms. He was like a father to me. He was like a son to me, okay? So this was a time, and then also people, cavers that participated in the Escuela Nacional de Speleología. So actually, I want to cover this gentleman's identity because I don't want you to know who he is. But this is a man from Matanzas who was a military officer who went to the Escuela Nacional de Speleología. He was not a caver, but it was through his learning of caves and going into the Cueva Santa Tomás that he became a caver. Okay, he became a caver, and I actually have this. I have it here in English. So, y estaré en la espeleología. He showed me. I interviewed him, and he showed me this caver book, and he said, y estaré en la espeleología. Oh, let me do it in English. I keep forgetting. And I will be in speleology until my eyes quit shining, since there is no cure for this little bug that bit me. What's more, without Mother Cavern, I cannot live. All right? Relatedness among cavers with the earth. Here it is, illustrated in a really powerful way. And again, this was a military officer who went to train that had nothing to do with caves, but came out very enamored with the cave world of Cuba. I have another example from Matanzas. Here's a caver who told me, we had great fortune of discovering a great cave during a difficult time. This was actually the early 1990s, okay? He told me this was nature's gift to us. With that gift came the responsibility to conserve it. This is why I stayed in Cuba, and because Jarrito, a cave, saved my life. And in fact, this is the caver who allowed me to share his identity, Esteban Grau, and here he is in Cuba, okay? Regional bonds are so strong. So here's a group called Caverna of young cavers, and they identify closely together, okay? They also have mentors, their mentors is another club from Artemisa, who mentors them to become cavers. And something that is very interesting, they train together, okay? Here they're practicing rope techniques. This is actually in the town of Sagua back in 2018. So these are members of the kind of like a mentor group. So the mentor group apadrina, again, a kinship term, apadrina, the younger cavers, okay? So they're like the padrinos of these younger guys. They train together, right? Here they are again practicing techniques. They go exploring together. In fact, they were our hosts. 2 clubs were our hosts in an expedition back in 2018. And it was during this expedition that I learned that Cuban cavers develop a very strong also kinship relation with local rural communities, okay? And in fact, one of the cavers told me, look, we have a lot of power in deciding where we want to go with our foreign caver friends. And he said, look, after all, if we have their permission, the permission of the local inhabitants, that is what matters. They are the ones who live here and who have known us for years, all right? Just to give you a sense of the kind of agency that these cavers have at the local and regional level. And importantly, a lot of the caver knowledge that is gathered locally and regionally is maintained within these groups that cave together. So these insights illustrate the need to account for a more relational approach to what I call an intimate geopolitics, okay? Including processes and experiences of militarization,
which consider the complex lives, collectivities, imaginings, and agency of human beings in relationship to the earth. And as I have shown, it is necessary to assess how this relationality both structures and is structured within these collectivities. What am I talking about? Well, I'll give you a sense of how the Sociedad Speleológica de Cuba is structured. And it's not just a story of defending the nation. It's a story of people caving together and creating very strong bonds of identity and relatedness among each other. And that impacts how they produce, how they manage, and how or whether or not they share the data that they gather in the field, okay? So I have this great quote from this great human geographer that I really admire. She talks about like this idea of intimate geopolitics, and she says, bodies not only are territory, but are also making territory. And I suggest that something similar is happening too here with the cavers. And it is crucial, however, to speak not of bodies alone, but of beings, of human beings doing things together, culturally, often bound to each other and to place and earth in the intimate ways. And herein lies the agency and affective quality of this practice, this relational intimacy that is both a precondition of and further result of subterranean knowledge. Finally, I want to highlight the obvious gendered qualities of relatedness of speleological practice. While women, among many of them mothers, have always been part of the Sociedad Speleológica de Cuba, they remain a minority. And actually, I just wanted to note to you one of the most famous women who has been part of the Sociedad Speleológica de Cuba. This is actually Alicia Alonso, the dancer who just recently passed away. She was a member of the Sociedad Speleológica de Cuba and was part of this field practice in the making of the nation, but also in the making of relationships among people who caved together.
What
right?
year was that photo?
Oh man, I don't have the exact year.
Well, approximately.
Oh, but it was in the 60s.
60s, okay.
Yeah, I don't have the exact
Yeah,
year.
no, I just wondered.
Yeah, so here she is. So, and as of 2019, the SEC has 627 active members, but only 116 females, okay? Now, I want to say, male speleologists have often counted and continue to count on the domestic or even field support of partners and wives. This is true everywhere, okay? In Venezuela as well, and even in the United States. Introductory biographies of Núñez Jiménez rarely, if ever, mention his wife, Lupe Vélez, or his daughters, for example. Indeed, it is one of his daughters, historian Liliana Núñez Vélez, and here she is, and it's kind of hard to see it, in an amazing event she organized a couple of years ago, who presides over the Fundación Antonio Núñez Jiménez de la Naturaleza del Hombre, a very active NGO advancing her father's commitment to conservation of Cuba's natural and cultural heritage, including caves. And with that, I have reached the end of my talk, and here are my acknowledgments. Thank you.